I'm Cole Swensen, and I come from San Francisco. I was born and raised there, and I've been in Iowa City about 8 years, and I teach at the Iowa Writers Workshop, and I'm a poet and a translator. I had literally never been to the Midwest before until I came here. I was invited to be a guest visiting professor in the spring of 2001. And so I was at the time living in Denver, so I drove from Denver to Iowa City, and it's the first time I've been here. That's an interesting question in itself. And I would probably not be the one to know the answer, in part because people who don't know the kind of work that I do and aren't really familiar with contemporary poetry would probably be asking, what's going on here? Or what's this mean? Or, people who are a little more familiar might be asking, how is this achieving meaning? What is the aesthetic project here? People who are really familiar with poetry and read a lot of it would probably have no questions at all. So maybe a way of saying that the work is not very quote-unquote accessible, so it doesn't seem readily, it's not like language that you encounter in a straight narrative situation, and people often then think that they should figure it out, or they should somehow be able to decipher it and come out of it with a transferable meaning. They should be able to say to somebody else, oh, this poem is about X, but the kind of work I do actually doesn't work that way. It is meant just to simply be read as a visual oral experience. And in a certain sense, it means nothing other than itself. And so it's hard to paraphrase. I think it would be things about the aesthetic project, why I work with a kind of opaque language, the idea about whether I view language as a vehicle or as a material. And I think they would ask that because they're sensing that, in fact, I approach it as material, and am interested in the material qualities, which shows up most readily in sound relationships, but would also be subtler things. And what I try and work against all the time is a transparency where the language seems to be carrying meaning that is separate from itself. I want the palpability, the sound, the texture of the word to be part of the meaning as well, so that those two are inseparable. Actually, the Luxembourg Gardens in Paris would be, I work there a lot. It's a public garden. I don't know that it's quiet because there's so much that goes on in it. It's a huge garden that's used by people of all ages. Children go there to play, adults go there to read, high school students go there to hang out with their friends and do their homework, and there are chess boards and there are playgrounds and all sorts of things go on, but you can always find a quiet place. And I work there a lot simply because I like to be outside, and that's a place where you can be outside and also have space to work and kind of your own spot. Certainly, I think at the moment I've been very influenced by recent work done in research-based poetics, the idea of shifting the focus from the I as identified with the writer, him or herself, to a subject matter out in the world, where there still is an I in the work, there's an I in the poetry, but that I is usually an historical character or an historical position. And so I've been reading a lot. In fact, the seminar that I'm teaching this fall is on research-based poetics and looking at various ways that other people use different kinds of subject matter. So everything from someone who is using a road trip through the Midwest to someone who's looking at extinction of species to someone who's looking at physics and comic book characters, like all these different things that people are mining for information. And one of the things that interests me is the difference between the language of information, language which does convey concrete information, and language as art. Whereas I was talking about before, it's the palpability, the physical qualities of the language that matter, that you're really sculpting. And to put those two together and try to get language to both carry concrete information and have this sort of sculptural form at the same time. So lots and lots of people are influencing me at the moment. I'm looking at a lot of different things for that kind of research. I do most of my writing either in France, because when I'm in France, I spend usually 3 to 4 months in the summer and then a month in the winter there every year. And I don't have the obligations that I have here. When I'm here, I spend most of my time with my students, either on their work, prepping for class, meeting with them one-on-one, doing that kind of thing. I pretty much focused on that. When I'm in France, I have a different kind of time, like long blocks of time when I can immerse myself in my own projects. I find that without immersion, it's really difficult to get solid writing done. I can tweak things, I can kind of revise while I'm here, and in which case I do it right at that table in there in front of my wood stove. And that's an interesting question. And I would say any place, like trying to work outside the world, like at a cafe with overhead music. And I do like to work, again, usually in France, in cafes. And until recently, just socially, no cafes would ever have overhead music. It was seen as a just completely crass thing. And so there was this great hubbub of voices. It's kind of a murmur of the sea in the background. But recently, more and more cafes have overhead music. So now, when I am writing outside in cafes, I have to find the right cafe that isn't playing overhead music. And it is funny. Obviously, it's individual what different people's minds will track, but I find that's the problem. If my mind catches, and for me it's music, it'll catch it and just be drawn along by it, whereas other people's voices my ear won't catch. And they'll just kind of babble on through it. It's rather pleasant to have that in the background. And, but I work best in absolute silence too, so. Often through visual art. I write a lot on visual art. And so going to museums, going to galleries, looking at visual things, getting completely away from school and those things. I think that's why I've liked to break my life completely. And when I'm not in school, I'm in another country, speaking another language, just completely separate. Because I think just that break, it's such a different kind of attention. And I really love teaching. So I think most people who do teach really love it. And it's a project of scholarship. I'm constantly studying. I study much harder as a teacher than I ever did as a student. And that is completely engrossing. And so to break away from that, it has to be a pretty absolute break. And then I can focus on the writing. But I think the scholarship during the teaching year recharges my batteries for the writing, and the writing kind of recharges my batteries for the studying. So it works really well as a dynamic. Again, it's a really interesting question. And I would say no, not categorically. Writing isn't for me a kind of filter of my own personality in any way. I mean, other than the fact that there's always a way in which writing is of the author, but probably for me a bit less than many people. On the other hand, I'm really aware of obsessive words or repeated words. And so depending on each book I do is very different. And depending on the book, each book will have its own obsessive words. So for instance, I'm just finishing a manuscript for University of California that's on ghosts and haunting, and the word turn and the image of somebody turning and turning around and doing something comes up again and again. And so with that, I've been specifically looking at it and thinking, how can I make it so that it's that gesture, that image of someone turning is something that's haunting the book as a whole and yet doesn't become repetitive. And the other one that comes in there is the image of someone on a staircase. And trying again to get it so that it repeats in a way that is useful for the book, that has this haunting quality, but that doesn't simply become repetitive, so that someone isn't saying, haven't we been hearing that word staircase a whole lot? It's like, she has a small vocabulary. So trying to make sure that repeated vocabulary has a point to its repetition. I'm sure there is, but it would be more in terms of an emotional tone and an ethical edge. I think I find it very hard that I'm really interested in the ethics of creative arts and how the creative arts can take an ethical stance in this country and actually can contribute to an ethical consciousness. And I think it's very hard for me to do without becoming didactic, pedantic, all these things that I'm trying to avoid. So if there's something I'm trying to avoid in my work, it is didacticness, pedanticness, and yet would really love to kind of approach more ethical questions in a more concrete way. And I haven't found a way to do that. I'd also like to incorporate more information. I'd really like to play with tone so that I have more of a prose, concrete prose informational aspect that creates a tension with the lyrical sound-based aspects. So that's something I'm constantly working on. To me, the difference between the ethical and the spiritual is not an absolute. There's a real continuum there, and I'm definitely interested in the aspect of the spiritual. I always approach it extremely obliquely because I think, like the ethical, it's too easy to get didactic. But I think this project, the book Gravesend that's on the ghosts that I just finished, is definitely playing. I mean, you can't talk about ghosts without that coming into it. But for some reason, I didn't want to approach the question directly. And it could be that for many people it is toxic, and I don't want to incite that toxicity. But personally, I think it's really a shame that in our country, all aspects of religiosity have become increasingly associated with the extreme right wing. And I think we don't want to give them that. That's too important an aspect of life to let that be taken over by the right. And it's a crisis that I think we need to be looking at. How we can claim a kind of spiritual leftism that is socially progressive, that obviously the basis of such a thing would be in social projects, social concerns. So long, kind of strange way to answer your question, but I don't think that writing is dissociated from living. And so the spiritual and its imperatives definitely are there.